The yellow school bus pulled up to the curb in front of Monroe High with its usual groan, brakes hissing as the doors open. Students flooded out in clusters, laughing, chatting, jostling for position as if the sidewalk were a stage, and they were the stars of a performance they'd been rehearsing for years. In the midst of it all, a single figure stepped down quietly, unnoticed by the crowd. Alina Monroe. Her name wasn't yet known in the hall she was about to enter, and that was precisely the way she preferred it. With her black hoodie pulled tight over her head and her eyes steady but guarded, she exhaled softly and adjusted the strap of her worn-out backpack. Her feet hit the concrete like whispers, not making a sound. She looked up at Monroe High, the tall brick building looking like a castle of memory and pressure. It could have been any school, really. From the outside, they all looked the same. But Alina had stopped pretending schools were ever about just learning. They were ecosystems, carefully curated hierarchies where you learned far more about power and perception than you ever did about history or math. Alina had moved around more times than she could count. Her mother was always chasing stability that never stayed, and Alina had long given up on growing roots. Each new school was a stage to rehearse her silence, a chance to slip through unnoticed, to be invisible enough to survive. Her goal at Monroe High was simple: finish senior year, keep her head down, and get out. But survival isn't just about silence. And as she crossed the threshold into her new reality, something in the air felt different, tighter. The halls of Monroe High were alive with a pulse of adolescent chaos. Posters fluttered on the walls. Lockers slammed like percussion in a song of teenage noise. And somewhere amid the mess, the system was watching. The one made not by adults, but by students. The unspoken rules. The power brokers. Alina felt it instantly. Not just the glances tossed her way, but the assessments, the quiet cataloging, what she wore, how she walked, how she didn't look around for validation. To some, that kind of self-containment was threatening. She found her locker with the help of a crumpled map from the main office. As she twisted the dial, she caught a name in passing: Jessica Vaughn. It was spoken with reverence, with fear. "She runs things here," someone whispered to another. "Her brother's Braden Vaughn, senior, football captain. Their parents basically fund the school." Alina didn't look up, but she listened. Jessica Vaughn wasn't the kind of queen bee you saw in movies. She didn't strut in pink or giggle at locker mirrors. Her power was quieter, sharper, calculated. She walked the halls like they owed her rent, her long blonde hair swaying like a metronome of dominance. Flanked by Sierra and Madison, her loyal shadows, she never had to speak twice. It didn't take long for Jessica to notice the new girl. In a school where everyone's identity was known, Alina's mystery was a spotlight she hadn't asked for. Lunchtime was the first real test. Alina sat alone at a corner table, her tray sparsely filled, her eyes scanning but not engaging. It was a quiet ritual of solitude. That was when she heard it. "New girl looks like she thinks she's better than everyone," Madison said, not even trying to whisper. "Probably thinks she's edgy," Sierra added, sneering. Alina didn't move. She didn't react. That was her power: invisibility. But silence, when wielded well, has its own kind of noise. And Jessica? Jessica didn't like the sound of it. She approached the table, her presence casting a chill that swept over the crowd. Alina didn't look up, didn't need to. She felt her coming. Jessica tapped the table twice. "You lost?" Alina finally looked up. Her eyes met Jessica's without a flicker of emotion. "No," she said simply. Jessica blinked. The answer wasn't rude. It wasn't even defiant. It was just calm. That calmness made Jessica uneasy. But Monroe High ran on performance, and Jessica knew when she had an audience. She smiled sweetly and tipped Alina's drink with a manicured finger. The water spilled across the tray. The cafeteria paused. A silence that always follows calculated cruelty. Alina exhaled softly, picked up her tray, and walked to the trash can. She didn't speak, didn't look back. But as she passed Jessica, she paused just long enough to say, "You should be careful. You never know who people really are." Then she walked out, her back straight, her steps unbothered. Whispers began to ripple. Not laughs, not gasps, just whispers. Because something about the way Alina carried herself unsettled people. Not fearful, not angry, just unreadable. Jessica didn't know yet that she'd made a mistake. Alina didn't talk about the past. She didn't bring up Chicago, or the school she'd been kicked out of, or the boy who had left in an ambulance because he didn't know when to stop pushing. She didn't explain the gym she trained in after school since she was 6, or the trophies boxed up in her closet because her mom was always too tired to care. She didn't need to. Some truths don't need telling until they have to be shown. That night, Alina sat at the edge of her bed in the small apartment she and her mother had moved into just a week before. The room was bare except for a mattress, a small desk, and a stack of books. She tied her hair back, lithely stretching her arms and neck. The silence of the apartment was a kind of freedom. It didn't ask questions, it didn't demand a smile. She went over the day in her head, not the mockery, not the spilled water, but the moment Jessica looked at her and saw something she couldn't define. That was the moment everything shifted. Because power, real power, isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It walks into a room and makes people pause without saying a word. Alina knew who she was, and soon Monroe High would too. Not because she wanted to fight, but because some fights come looking for you. There was a chill in the air as Tuesday morning rolled in, the kind of cold that settled into bones and made even the bravest students of Crestwood High retreat deeper into their hoodies and jackets. For Sanaa Hill, the cold was the least of her worries. As she stepped off the bus and made her way toward the entrance, the weight of silence followed her like a shadow. Not because people weren't speaking, they were, just not to her. Whispers curled through the hallway like smoke, thin and elusive. Snatches of comments slipped between locker doors and drifting laughter. She thinks she's tough. Did you hear what happened yesterday? Ryan tried to humiliate her, and she didn't even blink. Sanaa kept walking. Her steps were steady, her eyes forward. She didn't run from rumors, but she didn't feed them either. That had always been her code. Let people talk. Let them wonder. It was safer that way. Safer for them. The encounter in the cafeteria the day before had stirred something, not just in her, but in the school. Sanaa's silence had been louder than any insult they threw her way. Her calm demeanor had unnerved them. It was the kind of reaction that didn't just confuse bullies, it threatened their power. And people like Alina Monroe did not like having their power threatened. Lila was waiting when Sanaa reached her locker, leaning casually against the one next to it, arms folded, smirk in place. Ava and Brielle stood behind her like silent armor. But this time, there was a fourth figure, Jaden Ross, Lila's boyfriend, the school's star athlete. He was the kind of boy who didn't have to speak to command attention. His presence was enough, and now he was standing there, watching. "Morning, new girl," Lila said sweetly, though her tone curled with mockery. "Sleep well after your big performance yesterday?" Sanaa opened her locker without a glance. She didn't answer. "You know," Lila continued, stepping closer, "most people would at least pretend to be a little scared after what happened. It makes things easier." Sanaa reached into her locker and pulled out a notebook. Still silent, still calm. Jaden let out a low chuckle. "Maybe she doesn't scare easy," he said. And though his words were light, there was something else behind them. Curiosity. Or maybe admiration. Lila didn't laugh. Her eyes narrowed. Or maybe she just doesn't understand how things work around here. Still, Sanaa said nothing. She turned, closed her locker, and walked away. But not before catching a flicker of something in Jaden's eyes. A pause, barely a second long, but real. It was enough to unnerve Lila more than anything else. The rest of the day passed like a slow drumbeat, anticipation building with every class change, every glance thrown her way. They were waiting for something, for her to snap, for her to give them what they wanted. But Sanaa didn't break. It wasn't until last period gym class that the pressure finally peaked. The bleachers were half filled as students filed into the gym. Coach Langston, distracted as usual, tossed out the basketballs and barked at them to play a quick scrimmage game. No teams, just chaos. Lila and her crew made sure Sanaa ended up on their side. At first it was subtle, a pass thrown too hard, a shoulder brush just a little too forcefully. Sanaa let it slide. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. Then came the elbow. Ava slammed into her on a rebound, sending Sanaa sprawling to the hardwood. The gym quieted for a moment. Sanaa sat up slowly, eyes narrowing slightly. The room watched, waiting. She stood, brushed herself off, and kept playing. Next came the trip. This time, it was Lila. Leg extended just enough as Sanaa pivoted. She hit the ground hard. Someone laughed. But Sanaa didn't get up right away. She stayed there, breathing slowly, letting the silence stretch. When she did rise, it was with the same unshaken composure. Only now, her eyes held something different. Not anger, not pain, precision. Lila saw it, and for the first time, she felt a whisper of uncertainty. After class, in the locker room, the energy shifted. The usual chatter was muted. Sanaa stood at her locker, changing silently. Lila leaned in from the far end, smirking. Accidents happen, Hill. You should be more careful. Sanaa met her gaze then, truly looked at her, and Lila, for all her bravado, felt a chill crawl up her spine. Be sure you want to find out what happens when I stop being careful, Sanaa said, voice low. Lila blinked. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. That night, Sanaa sat on the edge of her bed, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her mother was out working a double shift. The apartment was quiet. But inside her, storms brewed. She pulled out her journal. The pages were filled with sketches, training routines, and memories. Faded photos of her old gym, of her coach back in Baltimore, notes from sparring matches, quotes her father used to say before he passed away. One of them stared back at her now, written in bold ink. Power isn't how hard you hit, it's how long you can stay standing. She traced the words with her fingertip. Tomorrow will be different. She had tried walking away, had given them every out. But some people only understood one kind of language. And Sanaa, she was fluent. The next day, Crestwood High buzzed with energy before the first bell even rang. The rumor had spread like wildfire. Something was coming. The new girl had had enough. And Lila? She still thought she was in control, but the balance had shifted. And soon, everyone would see what happened when you pushed the wrong girl too far. The late afternoon sun had begun to dip below the rooftops by the time Kiara Langley stepped through the side doors of Eastbridge High. Her footsteps echoed against the brick walls as she crossed into the shadowed lot behind the gym, each step deliberate, calm, controlled. Her hood was pulled low, but her posture held no uncertainty. She wasn't sneaking. She wasn't hiding. She was done doing that. Word had spread fast, the way things always did in high school hallways. Quicker than fire, sharper than fact. By lunch, everyone knew. Behind the gym, after the final bell, no teachers, no cameras, just a show of power. But the ones who set the stage hadn't realized they weren't the ones holding the script. A loose circle had already formed by the time she arrived. The usual crowd gathered out of thrill, boredom, or curiosity. Some held phones in hand. Some kept their distance, unsure what exactly they were about to witness. Kiara scanned their faces without stopping. She wasn't interested in who watched, only in who started this. Bria Hanover was waiting. She stood at the center like she owned the place, arms crossed, chin tilted slightly upward, lips curled in a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. Her entourage flanked her: Cassidy, Dina, and Jules. They had spent the last 2 weeks pushing, poking, needling Kiara like a game they thought they could control. What they didn't realize was that they'd been circling a storm. "Didn't think you'd actually show," Bria said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Her voice carried confidence, but Kiara caught the hesitation behind it. She didn't reply. Bria stepped forward, her sneakers scraping the pavement. "You walk around like you're better than everyone, like you're some kind of mystery, but I think you're just scared. All that silence? It's fake." Still, Kiara didn't move. Bria's smile widened as if she had won something. "What? Nothing to say?" Kiara finally looked up, her gaze cutting straight through her. "You should be careful, Bria. Not everyone who stays quiet is weak." That stopped Bria. Just for a second. The crowd, who had been murmuring quietly, fell into a hush. Jules laughed to break the tension. "She's trying to sound tough now. That's adorable." Kiara kept her eyes on Bria. "You wanted a show. I'm here to give you one truth instead." The air shifted. It wasn't the kind of threat that made people flinch. It was the kind that made people think, that made them look twice. Bria tilted her head, mocking. "What truth? That you don't know how to fight back?" Kiara took a step forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't clench her fists, but every word came out with clarity. "That strength doesn't come from attention. It comes from surviving when no one is watching. And I've had to survive far more than you can imagine." Cassidy muttered something under her breath. Dina rolled her eyes. Bria's smirk faltered, and then she shoved Kiara. It wasn't hard, but it was loud. It was meant to spark something, meant to ignite a fight for the crowd. Kiara stumbled half a step, then straightened, calmly. Bria was already gearing up again. "Come on, hit me. Isn't that what you want? Show everyone how strong you are." E. Kiara shook her head slowly. "You still think this is about a fight." Bria lunged, and that was the line. In a single motion, Kiara sidestepped, her hand catching Bria's wrist, and with controlled precision, she redirected the momentum. Bria slammed to the ground before she even knew what happened. Not hurt, not bruised, but humbled. The crowd gasped. Phones wavered. Bria lay there blinking up at the sky, her mouth parted in disbelief. Kiara stepped back. "You crossed a line when you made it your mission to break people who never asked to be part of your game," she said, voice steady. "But what you didn't realize is I already know what broken feels like. And I learned how to put myself back together. You? You just learned how to push." Cassidy rushed forward, but Kiara raised her hand. "Don't, unless you want to leave here the same way." Cassidy frozen. From the back of the crowd, someone whispered, "She didn't even hit her." Another replied, "She didn't have to." The circle broke apart slowly, students dispersing in awkward silence, unsure what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the brawl they expected, it wasn't loud or messy, but it was unforgettable. Kiara turned and walked away, no gloating, no satisfaction, just a steady breath and a spine that didn't bow. Inside, though, her pulse pounded. That evening, she sat across from her grandmother, Angela Langley, at the worn wooden kitchen table. The tea kettle hissed on the stove, and the room smelled like cinnamon and chamomile. Angela watched her quietly, her eyes sharper than her age let on. "It happened, didn't it?" Kiara nodded. Angela didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. She knew that look, that quiet turmoil wrapped in a practiced stillness. "Did you fight?" she asked. "No," Kiara said. then paused. But I ended it. Angela poured the tea, her movements graceful. There's power in knowing when not to fight. But there's greater power in making sure people know you could. They sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the tea steeping into the space between them. I just wanted to be invisible, Kiara whispered. You were never invisible, Angela said gently. You were just unseen. Now they know where to look. Kiara sipped her tea, letting the heat ground her. At school the next day, the hallways felt different. Not quieter, but more aware. Heads turned when she passed, not with mockery, but with something closer to respect. Bria wasn't in first period, or second. When she finally showed up before lunch, she walked alone. No entourage, no smug smile. Kiara saw her from across the hall, their eyes met, and for the first time, Bria looked away first. That moment said more than any shove or punch ever could. Later that afternoon, Kiara sat alone at a table in the library, tracing her fingers over the edge of a book she wasn't really reading. A voice startled her. Mind if I sit here? It was Aidan Lewis, quiet, thoughtful, with a reputation for keeping to himself. Kiara had noticed him once or twice before, but never exchanged more than a passing glance. She nodded. He slid into the seat across from her. That thing yesterday, that was something. I didn't want it to be, she said. Exactly why it mattered, he replied. They didn't speak much after that, but the silence between them was different than the silence she was used to. It wasn't avoidance. It was a presence. When she left the library, she realized something strange. Her shoulders weren't tense. Her breath wasn't shallow. She had walked in expecting to disappear. She walked out knowing she couldn't. Because sometimes, survival wasn't about hiding. Sometimes, it was about standing so still, so grounded, that even a storm had to bend around you. And from that day on, Eastbridge High remembered the moment they tried to break Kiara Langley. They just didn't know it was the moment she began to rise. The next morning, something about Westbridge High felt different. The sunlight slanting through the windows seemed softer, quieter, as if the school itself were holding its breath. Students clustered in the hallways, talking in lower voices than usual. The cafeteria wasn't buzzing with the usual morning noise. Something unspoken had changed, not in policy, not in rules, but in atmosphere, and everyone knew why. Emery Ward walked through the doors with the same quiet strength she always carried, but now the silence around her wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. Her presence no longer felt like an outsider's shadow. It was a force everyone had witnessed but couldn't quite define. She wasn't feared like a threat, nor followed like a queen. Instead, she was respected. And that, in a high school ruled by image and performance, was a different kind of power entirely. As she moved through the hallway, some students stepped aside. A few offered small nods. Most still didn't know what to say. They weren't sure if they were supposed to be impressed or afraid, but they understood one thing clearly. She wasn't the girl to test. Not anymore. Emery didn't walk with swagger or defiance. Her expression was calm, focused, almost gentle. But behind that calmness, those who had seen what she did behind the gym knew the strength she carried wasn't just in her fists. It was in her restraint, in her clarity. In this way, she had refused to turn violence into a show. She hadn't tried to dominate. She defended herself with precision, ended the fight with purpose, and walked away as if it never happened. That was what haunted her enemies most, that she didn't need the aftermath. She didn't need the credit. Charlotte and her crew were nowhere to be seen that morning. Rumors swirled that Ryan had called in sick, that Zane was avoiding gym class, that Charlotte had been pulled into the principal's office early and hadn't come out since. No one could confirm the details, but the absence was loud. In the second period, Emery took her usual seat at the back of the class. For the first time, a girl she didn't know turned in her chair and whispered, "Hey, that was really something." Emery looked at her and gave a small nod, not out of pride, but appreciation. She didn't need the praise. She just needed the noise to quiet. Later that day, Ms. Laurel, the guidance counselor, called her into her office. Emery expected the usual tone, concern wrapped in protocol, but what she found was something different. "You know," Ms. Laurel said, folding her hands on her desk, "I've been here 12 years. I've seen a lot of kids try to prove themselves in the wrong ways, but I don't think that's what you were doing." Emery stayed silent. "I watched the security footage," she continued, "not because I wanted to catch you, but because I wanted to understand. What did I saw? That wasn't a student picking a fight. That was someone setting a boundary." Emery looked up, surprised. It was the first time an adult had gotten it. "You didn't come here to start something," Ms. Laurel said softly, "but you finished something that needed to end. I hope you know the difference." That night, Emery sat on the floor of her room, the hum of the city faint outside her window. She pulled out her journal, a leather-bound notebook she'd carried since she left her last school, and wrote a single sentence. "I am not the storm. I am the wall that stands in front of it." Her father knocked on the door. "You okay?" She nodded without turning. "Yeah, just thinking." He stepped inside, sat down beside her. For a while, they didn't speak. Then he said, "You don't have to fight to be strong, Em. You already are." She looked at him. "But sometimes, fighting is the only thing that stops the cycle." He didn't disagree. As the week passed, something unexpected happened. Other students, ones who had been quiet, overlooked, or dismissed, started speaking up. One girl reported a long-time bullying issue to the administration. Another started sitting beside Emery at lunch, sharing notes and slowly opening up. Even a group of boys from the wrestling team nodded to her respectfully in the hallway. The ripple effect wasn't loud, it didn't go viral, but it was real. Charlotte returned a few days later. Her walk wasn't as commanding. Her eyes scanned the hall like she was searching for an old script that no longer worked. Her entourage had thinned. Ryan walked 10 steps behind. Zane kept his head down. Ava didn't even show up. When Charlotte passed Emery in the hall, she didn't make eye contact. She didn't speak. But the silence between them was louder than anything she could have said. In English class, Mr. Reed assigned an essay. Write about a time when silence spoke louder than words. Emery stared at the prompt for a long time before she started to write. She didn't write about the fight. She wrote about the moment she turned away, about the decision to walk instead of stand over someone in victory, about the power of choosing peace when war was easy. Mr. Reed handed her paper back a week later. He'd written in red ink across the top, "One of the most honest essays I've ever read." Spring slowly unfolded around them. The cherry trees lining the sidewalks outside the school began to bloom, and Emery found herself noticing things she hadn't before. A boy sketching comic panels in the margins of his math book. A teacher who played jazz softly during lunch duty. The way people's voices softened when they talked about someone they cared about. One afternoon, she stayed after school to help paint a mural. The art club had invited students from different grades to contribute a piece. Emery painted a simple image, an open hand with roots growing beneath it. When someone asked her what it meant, she said, "That strength doesn't have to be loud." No one argued. She didn't become popular. She didn't want to be. But she became something rarer in high school, trusted. People started asking her opinion. Teachers called on her not because they wanted her to speak, but because they knew she had something worth hearing. And when new students arrived, it was often Emery who greeted them first, not to save them, but to let them know they weren't invisible. At the end of the semester, Ms. Laurel invited Emery to speak at the Student Leadership Conference. Emery hesitated at first. She didn't see herself as a leader, but then she remembered her father's words and her own journal. When she stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. She began with a story, not about violence, but about silence, about how it had once been her shield and how learning to choose her voice had changed everything. She spoke about control, about dignity, about the strength it takes not to retaliate when you could. She ended with a message for anyone who had ever been made to feel small. You don't have to be loud to be powerful, you just have to stand. When she finished, the applause was real, but what mattered more were the conversations that followed. Students who came up to her, not for autographs or praise, but to say, "I felt that, thank you." That night, as Emery looked out over the city from her rooftop, she understood something she hadn't before. Power didn't come from control, it came from clarity, and she had never felt stronger. When Monday came, the halls of Crestwood High no longer echoed with the same rhythm. There was a shift, quiet but undeniable. Students who used to walk with blind allegiance to Devon's hierarchy now moved differently. The whispers that once revolved around outfits, rumors, and social status had changed their tone. Now, they carried names like Calla Jones. She didn't walk with a swagger. She didn't demand attention. But she held something rarer than fear, respect. After what had happened behind the gym, word had traveled fast. There were no videos, no posts, no viral content. Somehow, it had remained sacred, kept close by those who witnessed it, as if breaking that silence would lessen the truth of what they saw. And yet, the story was everywhere, recounted in detail and awe, about a girl who didn't scream or threaten, a girl who warned, a girl who dismantled power not with chaos, but with control. Calla noticed the shift, but she didn't indulge in it. She still walked the same hallway, still sat in the back of class, still brought her lunch from home and ate quietly at the far corner of the cafeteria. The same old notebook tucked under her arm, the same steel in her posture. But inside, something had shifted, not in pride, but in clarity. She had made a choice, not just to fight back, but to stand up without turning into what she stood against. And now, everyone who used to see her as invisible had been forced to see her fully. That, more than the fight, was what changed everything. Devin Santos had not returned to school, not that week, not the one after. Rumors spun in circles. Some said he was suspended. Others said his father pulled him out. Some believed he was hiding. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the silence he left behind was louder than anything he'd ever said. Amara and Jordan had returned, but even they walked softer now. The laughter was gone from their voices. Their entourage scattered, their place in the social food chain unraveled. And in that vacuum, something new began to grow. On the third Friday after the incident, a school-wide assembly was called. No explanation, just a directive from the administration: report to the auditorium after the sixth period. Calla didn't expect anything from it. She kept her expectations low. That had always been her survival strategy. But when she stepped into the vast, echoing space and saw Principal Hargrove standing center stage, not with his usual script or polished posture, her instincts stirred. Hargrove looked uncomfortable, like he was standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. The murmuring students settled slowly, uncertain. Calla took a seat in the back, her shoulders squared. The principal cleared his throat. This school has prided itself on tradition, on excellence, on standards. But sometimes, he paused, eyes scanning the sea of faces, tradition becomes a shield for silence, and excellence becomes an excuse to ignore injustice. The room shifted. Recently, he continued, something happened on this campus, something that exposed not just the failure of individuals, but of a culture we've allowed to grow unchecked. Calla didn't move, but her heart thudded louder. No one came to us with a complaint. No one filed a report. And yet, every adult in this room knows exactly what I'm talking about. The question is, why didn't we see it before? He turned toward the wings of the stage and gestured. A tall, athletic woman stepped into view, braids tucked behind her ears, a pressed navy blazer over her blouse. A new face. "This is Tasha Reed," Hargrove said, "our newly appointed Director of Student Equity and Engagement." The applause was tentative, confused, but Calla leaned forward. As Reed stepped up to the mic, her voice smooth, firm, and clear. "I'm not here to teach you how to behave. I'm here to help us all learn how to see." She spoke of safe spaces, of equity beyond the classroom, of accountability not just for students, but for faculty and systems. She spoke of peer-led initiatives, student advocates, and leadership groups that didn't revolve around GPA or popularity but values. She used words like dignity, empathy, empowerment, and then she said something that cracked through the haze. "There's a girl in this room right now who reminded everyone what true strength looks like, who refused to break, even when silence would have been safer. She didn't come forward seeking praise, but her actions spoke louder than any speech ever could. And because of her, we're changing the way we lead." Every head in the auditorium turned as if on instinct. Calla frozen. She didn't want this. Not the attention, not the spotlight. She had never wanted to be seen as anything other than someone trying to survive with her soul intact. Ms. Reed's eyes found hers in the crowd. And when she nodded, just once, it wasn't a call to the stage. It was something else. Recognition. Calla sat back slowly, letting the warmth of it settle into her chest like a rare sunlight. That afternoon, when she opened her locker, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. It wasn't a note of admiration or apology. It was a flyer, bold black lettering on white, "New Voices, Student Forum on Power, Identity, and Culture, Sign-up sheet in room 204. Below that, in handwriting that looked hurried but determined, "We want you there. Your voice matters." Calla traced the words with her thumb. She didn't know who wrote it, but she didn't need to. That evening, she walked home under a sky streaked with late autumn colors, leaves tumbling in loose spirals, her boots crunching on the sidewalk. For the first time since she arrived at Crestwood, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: roots. Not the kind that anchored her to pain, but the kind that tethered her to purpose. Back home, her grandmother sat by the window, sewing patches into an old quilt. The hum of the needle matched the rhythm of Calla's thoughts. "You look lighter," her grandmother said, not looking up. Calla smiled faintly. "Just breathing differently, I guess." "You walk differently too," the older woman replied, "like someone who knows the storm passed and left her standing." Calla sank into the chair across from her. "It's not done, but it's quieter." Her grandmother nodded. "That's how you know you won." That night, Calla opened a blank page in her notebook, the same one she used to bury poems she never read aloud. But this time, she didn't write to escape. She wrote to remember. Her first line: "I didn't change the rules. I reminded them they never worked." The ink flows steadily from there. At school, the whispers kept changing, not about fear, not about hierarchy, but about voice. Students began stepping into spaces they never had. A sophomore named Kelsey started a lunch-hour art group for kids who didn't feel like they belonged. A senior named Jay, once a silent bystander, began mentoring freshmen who got picked on in the gym. Small things, real things, not always loud, but always felt. Calla didn't lead them, she didn't need to. She had become something else. A symbol, not of rebellion, but of resolve. By winter, the forum was packed. Folding chairs filled with students, faculty sitting off to the sides, listening instead of leading. When Miss Reed asked Calla to speak, she didn't hesitate. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't drop. She didn't talk about Devin Santos or the fight behind the gym. She talked about the moments before it, the silences, the choices, the cost of being invisible for so long that you forget your own weight. She ended with a line that would be quoted for the rest of the year. It's not about being fearless. It's about knowing your worth, even when others refuse to see it, and refusing to let them decide who you are. In the end, it wasn't the punches that changed Crestwood High. It wasn't the takedown or the silence that followed. It was the fact that Calla Jones didn't need power to matter. She reminded them all, power without empathy is just noise. And sometimes, the quietest girl in the room is the one who rewrites the rules for everyone else. In the beginning, Calla Jones was just another face in the crowd, a transfer student at Crestwood High with no past anyone could dig into and no desire to make herself known. To most, she was invisible. But in a school ruled by whispered hierarchies and the silent terror of bullies like Devin Santos, invisibility was more survival than weakness. Calla didn't want power. She didn't crave attention. All she wanted was peace, a quiet, unnoticed path to graduation and the clean slate waiting beyond. But peace rarely lasts in a place where cruelty is currency. Devin and his loyal inner circle saw her quiet as challenge, her calm as defiance. And when power feels threatened, it tends to bite. First, it was the subtle taunts, then the louder ones, then the humiliation, staged to crush the spirit of someone they assumed wouldn't fight back. But what Devin and his crew failed to see was that Calla wasn't afraid. She was trained. She was composed. And above all, she had already survived more than any of them could imagine. When Devin crossed the line, when words became action and cruelty turned physical, Calla responded not with rage, but with absolute precise control. What unfolded behind the gym that day wasn't a brawl, it was a revelation. The girl they had mocked, cornered, and underestimated had shown them exactly who she was. And in doing so, she didn't just defeat them. She shattered the illusion they had built around themselves. What followed wasn't a coronation. Calla didn't become the new queen of Crestwood. She didn't replace Devon on some social throne. Instead, she became something far more powerful, a mirror, one that made everyone else reflect on who they had been, who they had enabled, and what they would tolerate going forward. Devon disappeared. His absence was more powerful than any apology could have been. Amara and Jordan lost the shine they used to wear so carelessly. And for the first time, silence in the school hallways wasn't something to be feared. It was the sound of change. Administrators, once comfortably distant from student realities, were forced to pay attention. Principal Hargrove, who had worn tradition like armor, finally acknowledged the cost of ignoring what festered beneath the surface. And with the hiring of Tasha Reed, the school found its first true advocate, a woman who knew that changing a culture meant first listening to the voices that had been ignored the longest. Calla didn't campaign for recognition. She didn't need validation. She kept showing up, the same as before. But others showed up differently around her. Students who had stayed quiet began to speak. Those who had been afraid to stand up began to find courage in her example. Peer support groups formed. Art initiatives were born. A mentorship program was introduced. Students from all walks of life began taking ownership of their space, their voice, their right to exist without fear. And through it all, Calla kept choosing calm, kept choosing restraint, because she had already learned that real strength isn't about overpowering others, it's about mastering yourself. In the months that followed, the impact deepened. The Student Equity Council wasn't just another after-school activity, it became a movement. Students who had once been sidelined were now drafting policies, advising staff, speaking at district events. The Evans Center for Leadership, once a forgotten wing of the school, was revived as a hub for culture building, empathy training, and conflict resolution. Calla was invited to speak more than once. She always hesitated, but eventually agreed. Her message never changed, but it grew deeper each time. She didn't talk about fighting. She talked about choice, about learning when to walk away and when to draw the line, about how silence can be power when used with purpose, and how real courage often looks like walking through fear without needing to prove anything. The final week of school, Calla stood on the auditorium stage in front of a packed room, not for glory, not to be celebrated, but because she was asked to speak one last time before graduating. She looked out over the crowd, students, teachers, parents, even some former skeptics, and she spoke not as the girl who had fought back behind the gym, but as the young woman who had changed the rules of what leadership looked like. "We were taught that power belongs to the loudest voice," she said. "That control is something you take. But I've learned that real influence isn't about being feared, it's about being felt, seen, heard. I didn't come here to lead, I came here to survive, and maybe that's why it worked, because surviving taught me something no textbook ever could. You don't need to win a fight to win back your worth. You just need to remember you had it all along." The crowd stood in silence, not out of shock, not out of obligation, but because they understood. And when Calla stepped off that stage, she didn't walk into applause. She walked into legacy. So what can we learn from Calla's story? We live in a world that rewards noise, spectacle, and dominance. But Calla reminds us that quiet strength can be louder than any scream, that dignity is a choice, and that standing your ground, even when no one is watching, can create ripples far beyond what you imagine. Control is power, not the control over others, but the control over self. In a moment when it would have been easy to unleash anger, Calla chose restraint. That choice didn't make her weaker. It made her unforgettable. Your story matters, even if no one asks for it, even if no one sees it yet. The truths you carry, the battles you fought, the quiet strength it takes to keep showing up, those things matter. You never know who's watching, who you might be inspiring just by refusing to give up. Change doesn't always start at the top. It often begins in the quiet corners, in the overlooked classrooms, in the moments no one documents. It starts when one person chooses not to follow the script, when they refuse to be defined by fear or silence. Leadership isn't about authority, it's about impact. You don't need a title to lead, you don't need permission to do what's right. You just need the courage to speak when others stay silent and the strength to stand alone if necessary. So, how do we apply this to our own lives? Start where you are. Ask yourself who's being ignored, who's being pushed to the margins, who's carrying burdens in silence. Be the one who sees them. And if you're the one carrying the weight, let Calla's story be your reminder. You are not weak, you are not alone, and you are not invisible. When someone tries to make you feel small, remember this. You don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight to prove strength. You just need to stand, steady, grounded, whole, because there will always be people who test your limits, who mistake kindness for softness, who confuse silence with surrender. But you know better. You are the storm they didn't see coming. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or helped you see someone else's worth more clearly, please support this channel. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, share this story,